Reflections from Torch Trust, focusing on Christian faith and sight loss.
Hello and a warm welcome to Reflections, the show from Torch Trust that focuses on faith and disability in today's world. I'm your host, Marilyn Baker, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Here at Reflections, we love hearing about different people's experiences with faith and sight loss. Every single person's story is different, and yet we often find similarities that let us know we really aren't alone. Today's story is a fascinating one. It's a tale of one man's sight loss journey and a spiritual calling which takes us from South Africa to Tennessee to Manchester. His name is Chich Hewitt, and he's been a friend of Torch for many years. Here he is speaking with our CEO, Tim Jeffrey.
So, Chich, it's great to have you with us. Thank you for agreeing to do this. And I guess to start with, it'd be really helpful for me to understand a little bit about your journey, because I hear an accent from you that isn't local to these shores. So a little bit about your journey, and then how sight loss has sort of featured in your life.
Thank you, Tim. It's lovely to be with you today. Yes, I still carry some of that South African accent. My wife and I were both born in Johannesburg, and I schooled there, went to university there, and did maths and statistics for a first degree, and worked for the South African Railways for 10 years in data processing, scientific programming actually, on computers which filled large rooms and couldn't do even a fragment of what this iPad can do on the top of my desk at the moment. And so I had that experience, but from my last year at school, or last couple of years, I had a calling into the ministry. And my parents wanted me to qualify at something first, hence the degree.
Right.
And I met my wife. She's a medical doctor. And when she'd finished her degree, I then went to for my theological training. That was in the late 70s in South Africa. And then my first parish was in a place called Vanderbijl Park, a mining, more actually an industrial town, I should say, large steelworks and coal fields there. And I had 5 years there. Then I became chaplain.
What sort of decade was that? Help us to sort of locate that in our history of South Africa.
Right. In fact, in 1976, when the Soweto riots took place, my wife was doing her house job at Baragwanath Hospital. And the next year, it was quite a time of turmoil in South Africa. The next year, 77, 78, I went for my theological training.
Okay.
I had a 2-year spell at college, then this time at Vanderbijl Park, and that was from 1979 to 1984.
Okay.
Then I became chaplain and eventually principal of a theological seminary in Grahamstown. And then I had a sabbatical offered to me, an 8-month one in Nashville, Tennessee. And we decided to, after that, to do something different and come to the UK for what we thought was a couple of years. Well, we came here in 2000 for the different church experience and never left.
Bad luck.
We've been in Manchester that time. Our daughters followed. We've got 2 girls. The younger one came the same year as we arrived, actually, and then older daughter a couple of years later.
Right.
So I don't think there's any chance of us moving away now. Been in the Manchester diocese, 2 parishes from 2000 to 2009, and then another one till 2014 when I retired. But the story of eyesight begins in 2008, 2009, because up until then I had perfectly normal vision and did everything people do and drove cars and so on. But I had this fading in my left eye, and it fooled the doctors. I had eventually a very caring and interested ophthalmologist, and she did every test imaginable and nothing showed up. The eye looked normal, but I wasn't seeing in the left eye. And then just at the time when I was changing parishes, I lost eyesight in the second eye.
Gosh.
And then the ophthalmologist noticed a slight change in the first eye, and I was referred to a neurologist who quickly diagnosed this Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy, it's called.
Thank you.
Quite rare. So what happens is the center vision goes, the optic nerve, it's like if you've got a computer, you've got an external device, and it's the cable which is faulty.
Yeah.
And so I've got no center vision,
Right.
but I've got peripheral, some side vision. It's bad enough to be registered blind, but I can see and enjoy scenery. Sometimes actually looking through binoculars can help a bit. But in the main, things are very vague. I can see your outline now. I'd never recognize you if you pass me in the street or anything like that.
Right.
So I use a white cane.
Okay.
But it was a challenge changing parishes when they accepted me into the parish with eyesight in one eye. And when I eventually arrived, I was registered blind.
Gosh.
We'll be hearing more from Chich in a few moments. But first, I'd like to share this wonderful thought for the week with you. It was written by Jill Ferraby, a former Torch employee and volunteer. Today, Jill is reflecting on the different seasons of life.
Recently, I have been thinking about the seasons we go through in our lives. Rainy seasons, bright seasons. We all have times when things are going really well and times when things are really hard. So how do we cope in the hard times? We have all either seen or heard about a rainbow, that most beautiful phenomenon of nature. But even more beautiful is the meaning behind it, as given us in Genesis chapter 9. It was set by God himself in the clouds as a sign that he would always keep his promise, that the earth would never again be totally flooded. Well, that is one particular promise, but of course it applies to every single promise God has ever made. And the Bible is absolutely full of them. Promises like, I will rescue you, I will sustain you, I will carry you. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. God will meet all your needs. Your ears will hear a voice behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. And he who promised is faithful. All these promises are like the many bands of colour within a rainbow. Bright, beautiful, awesome, even breathtaking, glowing with hope. One day I was driving back home from Torch House in Market Harbour on a day when we were having a mix of rain and sun. As I drove, a rainbow appeared straight ahead of me. It was so amazingly wonderful I just had to stop the car to savour its beauty, the brightness of its many colours glowing so beautifully against the dark clouds behind it. As I watched, almost breathlessly, it became even more beautiful and bright. Why? The clouds behind it were becoming darker and darker, forming an ever-improving backdrop for the rainbow itself. The darker the clouds, the brighter and more beautiful the rainbow. I started reflecting on God's equivalent in our lives, the rainbow of his promises shining in the dark times. Isn't it true to say that the darker those times become, the brighter, in contrast, do those promises shine? This is wonderful, and unlike the rainbow that is seldom seen and fades, God's promises are always there and never fade. So how do we cope in times of trouble, hardship, uncertainty, fear, anxiety, illness? By looking at the rainbow, not the clouds, and by resting and trusting in those great and wonderful promises. So, by God's grace and the help of the Holy Spirit, let's determine to fix our gaze on the best rainbow of all, the rainbow of God's promises found all through Scripture, and relish every aspect of its beauty.
That was lovely. And as Jill says, God truly is with us in every season of life. Dark, light, and everything else in between. Let's go back to Tim and Chich now to hear the next part of Chich's story.
It was a challenge changing parishes when they accepted me into the parish with eyesight in one eye, and when I eventually arrived, I was registered blind.
Gosh.
I had to think on the hop very quickly, how am I going to take services? And especially with the Anglican tradition where you have set liturgy, how on earth am I going to read that? And so I fiddled with equipment and began a system which I've used ever since. And that is to have a recording of the service. My wife kindly puts it on. She does it better than I do. And I used earphones. And as I hear the speech, I will say it a couple of words behind, rather like an interpreter would, except I don't have to interpret. I just say the words that I hear. And it works for me.
Wow.
Modern technology is amazing, and it's got so much better between losing my eyesight in the beginning of 2009 and the present.
So what are some of the technologies, Chich, that have been sort of most helpful to you that you'd recommend to others who are going through a similar sight loss journey?
Some people joke and say that I'm a spokesperson for Apple. It's not necessarily true. You know, one device is as good as another. Samsung and an Apple device, you know, they can all do clever things. But Apple technology is particularly good for sight loss, in fact, for accessibility. So I can zoom in the screen right now in and out, which helps me with a little bit of side vision. But also the talking software is brilliant. The Siri function and the voiceover function means that it'll read me anything on the screen, emails, books, newspapers, the whole lot.
Wow. So
I can be fairly flexible and versatile. And also some of the volunteering work I'm doing now in retirement, there's a local blind organization here called Henshaw's. And up until the lockdown, I was volunteering with a sighted colleague, helping people who are losing eyesight to use some of the technology which I found useful.
Brilliant.
So it's generally the Apple technology, but also devices like a clear reader, which photograph and read stuff to you. A device called a Victor Read or Victor Streamer, which is the one I've used so much in church work,
right?
Because that has the recording on it. I can slow it up, speed it up, bookmark, so I can move backwards and forwards to different things in the course of a service and so on. That's been a device I couldn't have done without.
Wow, that's amazing. And is there a particular message you would have, Chich? So if there was somebody watching this who was in the process of losing their sight or in the early stages of that, is there something that you would say to them?
Yes, that there is life out there after eyesight loss. And I mean, people are in different stages, say, with regard to technology. Some can cope with it, some can't. But, you know, there are books available on memory sticks through RNIB. There's so much around that you can lead a fairly active life. I had good support from local authority. I had got white cane training. There are all sorts of devices, and there's all sorts of help around. Torch, RNIB, as organizations, as of course local blind organizations, other people prepared to help. So there is a life out there after eyesight loss.
For me, as a sighted person, beginning to understand a little more about the world of folk with sight loss, what would your top tip to me be?
Yes, as others say, don't be concerned about language. If you say to me, can you see that such and such happens? Oh, I shouldn't have used the word see. Not fazed by that kind of language at all. Just be natural, just talk naturally and so on. And the useful thing is to ask what might be helpful rather than assume what I'm needing.
And Chich, I'm particularly also interested, I know that you have been doing some volunteering work with Torch's Sight Loss Friendly Church initiative. So if my wife watches this as an Anglican vicar or any other church leader watching this, what would your message be to folk who are sort of leading churches and responsible for church life?
Churches, I'm generalizing a bit, are not great on the whole matter of disability and accessibility and those sort of things until, the need arises. So for members of a congregation to engage with the Sight Loss Friendly Church program would be brilliant, and just learn what can be done in a church, which people don't think about. Steps in churches, marking steps is one issue, and helping people at tea and coffee time, identifying who you are, all those kinds of things.
Okay, thank you. Chich, lastly, what's your sort of reflection as you've gone from being a sighted vicar to somebody who's lost their sight, on the Bible? Some of your insights on what is it that's kind of come afresh to you as you have been on this sight loss journey?
There's a lot of interesting material out there. The Disabled God is one of the books, but John Hull is a very interesting man. I think many will have heard of him. And he was, quite radical in his thinking, believing that Jesus didn't really understand what eyesight loss was about until he himself had been blindfolded at the time of his suffering and crucifixion. And when people hit him and said, "Who's hitting you?"
Yeah.
And then he came to realize what it was about. Before then, he used phrases like, "When the blind lead the blind, both fall down into a pit."
Yeah.
So he's got quite an interesting aspect on it. The Bible is quite ambiguous in many ways on the aspect of disability, and there's a lot that is being done and a lot more can be studied on it.
Chich, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for making time to speak with me, and thank you for sharing your story with us, and may you know God's blessing on your continued ministry and life. Bless you.
Thanks. And God has been absolutely amazing in my journey. I think that's one reason why so many things, have been less painful than they could have been otherwise, that the Lord's been with me on that journey.
Thank you, Chich. I think your story will really inspire our listeners. And now it's time for us to go. We've just loved sharing this time with you, and we'll be back next week with another uplifting show. In the meantime, if you'd like to leave us a comment, question or suggestion, or to find out more about any of Torch's services for blind and partially sighted people, then do get in touch. The number to call is 01858 438 260. That's 01858 438 260, or you can email info@torchtrust.org. Until next week, from me, Marilyn, and everyone on the Reflections team, goodbye and God bless.
You've been listening to Reflections from Torch Trust.